Hello everyone, I'm going to take you through this online lesson about paper 2 and the Cold War aspect of paper 2 as well. It's 9:45 on a Saturday night and I'm working late because I'm a teacher. What I'll do, I'll go through all the content on here of what happened when. What you need to do is perhaps have your revision grids and make sure that you're filling things in as we go along. You can pause the recording, the YouTube itself as you go along if you want to, or you can just listen to it on your phone, on the smart TV, whatever you want to do, okay? Yeah. The questions you've got on the exam paper are pretty straightforward actually in comparison to all the others. A bit dull actually, I suppose, in comparison to all the others, because you've got to do the same thing. You've got to peel paragraphs, explain, as I would do it, about whether they increase or decrease tension in the Cold War, and you've only got three types of questions to look at, but they're all kind of similar. You've got an explain question for 8 marks, consequence of something, explain two or give two peel paragraphs about, in this case here, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Then you've got the narrative account question, which seems like a low amount of marks to me, because you've got to peel 3 paragraphs to show how 3 events are kind of connected. They give you 2, you've got to think of another one to stick at the beginning, middle, or end. It shows how it flows in the story, another word for narrative. And then the last one is you choose 2 out of the great big choices you've got there. And again, you explain 2 consequences in each one. So the first one there is about the development of the atomic bomb. So 2 peel paragraphs about that. And as you'll see, I would divide that up into like an immediate short-term consequence, but also a longer-term consequence as well. Again, peel paragraph, increase, decrease tension, whatever it is, okay? Yeah, so you've got explain, narrative, and important question. I mentioned the keyword there, consequent. You know, everything that was in the Cold War kind of has a knock-on effect onto something else. The politicians at the time used whatever they were doing, or whatever the other side, as justification for whatever they were doing now. You know, cancelling a visit because of the U-2 spy plane being shot down. Developing the hydrogen bomb because they had to go bigger than the atomic bomb that America had. So everything has a knock-on effect, just like dominoes. Because everything we've looked at so far in the Cold War are connected with consequences, as I just mentioned. We've looked at this already, going through history, through whenever we've studied it. For example, the Great Depression happened in October 1929. I doubt we would have heard of Adolf Hitler and him becoming Chancellor in 1933 if it wasn't for the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression. Chamberlain, following this policy of appeasement, if he hadn't done that, honestly, naively, then there's no way Hitler would have thought, right, I've got nobody to stand in front of me, and he would have probably never have invaded Poland if Chamberlain had stood up to him at that point, okay? And again, I'm not sure America would have ever got involved in the war if Japan hadn't launched that sneak attack in December at Pearl Harbor. Because they did, they had to make sure they won the war. How did they win the war? Well, for them, it was ensuring that Japan was completely destroyed. So they developed the atomic bomb. Okay, and it's not quite as simple as that, but these things on the right are all linked with those on the left. On this slide, we've got a rather nifty cartoon showing a roadmap, really, of the Cold War. And I think we've probably covered 99% of the events on here. If you've got a copy, then, well, I will give you it anyway. It's quite useful to use this as a revision tool. See if you can name 5 things, 5 bits of information to go with each of the events on here. That's useful because you should be able to create a peel paragraph about each one if you can do that. So, get a pen and draw all over it as well, okay? I think the only one we've not mentioned is Camp David, but that's not too important. What was the Cold War? The Cold War really is a term which describes the hostility, the existence of relations between the USA and the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, but you only have to write USSR in the exam, okay? And what did they do? Well, they tried to spread their ideology, their influence around the globe after the Second World War. In the Cold War, there's no actual fighting between armies or any of the military between the USA and the USSR, but the smaller nations do fight between themselves with the assistance, the weaponry, military assistance, and money from both of the sides. Okay, so, but between the two superpowers, it's threats, propaganda, all kinds of competition, but without any actual shooting. And they do compete in everything. Who's got the biggest military? Who's got the most soldiers? Who's got the fastest jets? Who's got the biggest rockets, cruise missiles? Okay, who's got the best economy? Whose economy is growing the fastest? Whose society is progressing more? Whose education system is best? Who's getting into space first and getting to the moon first? And even sport, who's got the best football teams? Who's got the best gymnasts, athletes, the Olympic athletes, that kind of thing, okay? Yeah. Where did it all start? You could say it started here, 7th of May 1945. General Jodl was marched into this school, which is still there today, and signed the unconditional surrender in a room upstairs. You can still visit that. That's in Reims in France, okay? 2 days later, the Germans had to surrender again to Stalin because he was not happy. There is Jodl signing the unconditional surrender. He was arrested, put on trial at Nuremberg, and later executed. And there's my family in 2018 when I dragged them along for a very exciting visit to this museum where the surrender was signed. Look at them all thrilled to bits to be there. Why do we end up with two superpowers then? Well, before the war, the two great powers were Great Britain and France, and they were allied against Nazi Germany, and they declared war on Germany and took them on. And France was invaded, and Britain survived the Battle of Britain and wasn't invaded. Okay, the USSR was on the side of Nazi Germany. They'd signed the Nazi-Soviet Pact to divide up Poland between them. In December 1941, Japan decided to take on the USA, attacked Pearl Harbor in the middle of the Pacific, and then the USA declared war on them. The USSR switched sides against Nazi Germany, and then everybody took on Germany and Japan until both were defeated. Okay. Even before the war, really, you could say this, but the French and the British empires were in decline. They couldn't hold on to them. Nationalism was on the rise. And so after the Second World War, countries achieved their independence, like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh from Britain, and Vietnam, for example, from the French. Okay, Germany was, of course, in total ruins after being devastated by World War II. Okay, so after the Second World War, you had two powers that were left standing, and they were the richest, most militarily and economically powerful United States of America and the USSR. Okay, so it's a term really that covers the most powerful countries economically, militarily. That's who they are. A key event in the Cold War is this one, 6th of August 1945. If you've seen Oppenheimer, it's all about this. But on the 6th of August 1945, America bombs Hiroshima, and it's the first time that the atomic bomb had been used in war. Had been tested the previous month at the Trinity site in New Mexico, and it was Little Boy that was the name of the bomb that was used to be dropped from Enola Gay. Okay, a devastating explosion, destroyed the city. At least 100,000 people and more were killed immediately. And people were still feeling the effects of the radiation poisoning months, years, decades later. Okay, the Japanese were offered surrender terms immediately by the Americans. They refused, and so the Americans bombed Nagasaki 3 days later, and then the Japanese surrendered. Okay, so this is a key event in the Cold War because everybody is trying to achieve that kind of weaponry and more of it, but at the same time avoid having to use it. They're all very keen to keep that weapon and those kind of weapons literally in their arsenal to use, but nobody wants to use those. Okay, nobody wants to allow any kind of situation to escalate militarily until that is the only option left. Everybody wants to avoid that, and boy, did we come close to it a few times. After the Second World War, you can see the Cold War, and as always, Winston Churchill saw it first before everybody else. He identified that this closure of the borders between those states occupied and being run by the Soviet Union were different. You know, they were now kind of lost behind closed borders, barbed wire, watchtowers, checkpoints, that kind of stuff. And this stretched all the way from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, he described it as. So this is a border running from the top of Europe all the way down to the bottom of Europe. And on the eastern side of it, they're the states controlled by the Soviet Union, and it's the democratic states that are on the other side in the west. Okay. And you can see I put a black line from the top to bottom there just to show you roughly where this unofficial border was. Okay, so it's not literally an iron fence or an iron curtain. It's barbed wire, walls, ditches, you know, normal borders, but no one's allowed out, and very reluctantly are people allowed in. I think I've kind of explained all that again. You might want to jot down a few points about what the actual Iron Curtain was. You know, 7,000 kilometers long, fences, walls, minefields, watchtowers. It's this that divide east and west, that kind of thing. Okay, and it separates democratic states from those controlled by the Soviet Union. Okay, did this affect the Cold War? Well, it's probably the first time we could say it, well, on this recording anyway. It increases tension, doesn't it? Because it creates suspicion. In the West, there's no way of knowing what's going on the other side of the Iron Curtain. There were no satellites in those days. It's very unlikely for spies from the CIA or MI5 or MI6 to infiltrate the East and report back. So the Western governments have no idea how the Soviet Union are doing in rebuilding their military. So certainly the development of this thing called the Iron Curtain does create increased tension. Okay, and either side, you've got these two very different societies developing. In the West, which is where we are then and now, anybody can own their own business, work for anybody else, buy and sell things. If you look at an election, there's lots of different political parties, all of them with different policies, all looking for people to vote for them, okay? And when there's an election on, a government is formed by the ones with the most representatives and whatever their House of Representatives is. For ourselves in this country, it's the House of Commons, okay? And you and I, anybody can own their own property, car, flat, house, mansion. That's the capitalist system based on capital, money, okay? On the other hand, in the East, it's a very different system. The government owns everything. Everything that is produced, they own. They decide how much of it is going to be produced, how much gets into the shops, what the prices are, those kind of things, okay? Everybody is working for the state, for the benefit of society. Anything that actually produces a profit, well, that doesn't go in the pocket of a private businessman, okay, like Elon Musk. It goes into the treasury and is then distributed amongst society. Now, you don't receive, you know, a packet with money in, but you feel the benefit of cheap education or free education, okay, free travel, that kind of stuff. This does mean, though, that in these countries, there is no other political party apart from the Communist Party. And they may have different titles like chairman or general secretary, but they are, to all intents and purposes, a dictator. There's no democracy, okay? And that's the communist system. So you've got capitalist on one side, all about money, okay? And on the other side, you've got a common society where everybody should be working for the benefit of the community, the people. What you also find in the Cold War is that the Soviet Union had some quite legitimate fears. You know, even today, these stand, and anybody involved in foreign policy has to bear this in mind. If you look at history, Russia had been invaded many, many times over the last 500-600 years, but in more recent times, World War One. There was a civil war which nobody knows about in 1918 between the Bolsheviks and the West, you know, British and American troops and French troops there, okay? And then, of course, you've got World War II starting in 1941, which the Russians call the Great Patriotic War. They are keen to make sure that this never happens again because, as I put at the bottom of the slide, in the last conflict, they lost 25, 26, 27 million people. And they always seem to lose millions of people every time they are invaded. So they want to make sure that this never happens to them again, okay? And Stalin had this genuine feeling that the West, the capitalist West, wanted communism to be destroyed, which they probably did, because, you know, if communism spread to their countries, people would lose their steel mills and coal mines, and freedom would be gone. Okay. On the other hand, you've got President Truman here, President of the United States at the end of the Second World War. He was convinced that the Soviet Union was trying to encourage communism to spread through revolutions and any way possible, really, through Europe and the rest of the world. They certainly were, okay? He, like many other Western leaders, saw communism as dangerous. You know, it would take over governments, economies, and destroy people's right to freedom, okay? So what he wanted to do was make sure that he could somehow stop communism spreading. Okay, so the old policy that we looked at in year 9 of isolationism, that was stopped. He wanted to be involved in Europe in the future to make sure dangerous dictatorships like in 1933, Adolf Hitler, and now Stalin and whoever came next were stopped. It's at this point in the course we would probably find an opportunity for a good old Peel question. Okay, so for example, in this one I've got explain 2 consequences of Germany's defeat in World War II. You will get 2 suggestion points, and I've added a third one here. Well, I've just mentioned this as an iron curtain across Europe. The USA has emerged as a superpower. Actually, there isn't going to be any suggestion points. I've just thought of 3 here for you. And then you have the Cold War developed between America and the Soviet Union. Okay, so you've got to peel 2 things here, but you've got to make sure that you keep these separate. So you'll have 1 point as an iron curtain. You'll peel a paragraph about that. The USA emerges as a superpower. You've got to peel a paragraph about that. You've got to make sure that you have 2 separate paragraphs. Okay, just to remind you what peel means, you've got a point. You've got some evidence, you've got to put some evidence in, so 5 bits of knowledge, names, dates, places, facts, figures, that kind of stuff. Then you've got to explain, and I've put because in capital letters to remind you to do it. This was a problem, this increased tension because it made war between East and West more likely, and that's a pretty stock phrase you can use in these paragraphs, okay? And then link it back to the question. Well, therefore, this is the consequence of whatever it was. In this case, it's Germany being defeated, okay? So you've got to stick to this structure. There's no point just writing Peel and then writing something completely different, like a long description. You've got to have a point, sentence, evidence, 4 or 5 bits of information in a few sentences. Then you've got to have an explanation. Then you've got to link it back, okay? These into 4 different colours to show you what the point is, how much you have to write for the evidence, how simple it is, and how little you have to write for the explanation. So in this case, this was important. It increased tension between East and West and showed that each feared each other, making war more likely. Okay, that's just a very simple explanation. Got to write that, and then the purple bit is linking it back. Okay, and you've got, when you're writing in the exam your Peel paragraph, put your point, write your evidence, and then read it again, quickly read it again, and ask yourself, is this increasing or decreasing tension? So in the case of this, you've got borders, fences, minefields, sealing one side of Europe off against the other. Well, that's hardly going to make things nice and happy and jolly, so therefore it is increasing tension, okay? Again, that's another example of a Peel paragraph about the USA becoming a superpower, the evidence being they developed the atomic bomb and dropped it, okay? Obviously that creates tension. One of the big events of the Cold War is the Tehran, Yalta, and Potsdam conferences, so big events actually. And we're going to look at the Tehran and Yalta conferences first. And you can see you've got the leaders there in the Grand Alliance, which is Joseph Stalin, um, Roosevelt, and Churchill. Okay. Easy way of remembering when they happened and which came first is think of these letters TYP, Tehran, Yalta, Potsdam. Worthwhile just jotting them down on a bit of paper or on the exam itself as well, because you're allowed to do that just to remind you. And the dates too. So Tehran, November 1943, where they planned what they're going to do to defeat Germany. Yalta Conference planned what they're going to do afterwards, because it looked like they were getting close to finishing the war, and D-Day had happened the previous year. And the Potsdam Conference is when the war is all over, and they're meeting in a town just southwest of Berlin, I think it is, and deciding what to do next, how to put into practice all their plans. Okay. Iran Conference then it was called Persia. Today we call it Iran. Okay, and you've got Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. That's when they met there. Their plans there were about liberating France and defeating Germany. Okay, how they're going to get troops into mainland Europe and what they're going to do from then on. These are the kind of things that they agreed upon. They agreed to meet, obviously, and they looked at how they're going to win the war. They agreed that they were going to invade Normandy in May 1944. They called it Operation Overlord, became known as D-Day, and it actually started in June, the 6th of June 1944. Okay, that was the when the beaches were attacked by the Allies. Okay. And these 5 beaches were named as Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword. I think there's a housing estate near the Deanery with most of those names naming the streets. And what you had on the 6th of June when it actually took place was over 350,000 military personnel, airmen, sailors, and troops attacking those beaches. And their aim was to get onto the beaches, into the land behind them, and to get a foothold in Europe and start to push the Germans back, which they did over the next year, very slowly, street by street, field by field, hedge by hedge. Okay. This was important because it was the start of the end of the war. It proved that they could work together. So, if you're thinking about why was Tehran important, it was the start of the beginning of the beginning of the end of World War II. Okay. And also at this point as well, it's worth noting that Roosevelt thought, yeah, I can work with Stalin. He's trustworthy. He's on our side. He's committed to Germany's defeat. And so it's all good at this stage. This meeting decreased tension. It led to the end of the war, and everything's looking nice and rosy between the two superpowers as they became. During the Tehran conference, Stalin made it clear that once they defeated Germany, he would switch sides and declare war on Japan. Okay, I've said this already. It proved that communism and capitalism could actually work together, despite how it seemed years later that they were completely different. At this time, they were sitting around a table, chatting, having lunch together, plotting the end of fascism. Also agreed some things that are even around today. They agreed that a United Nations is going to be set up. The purpose of that being is that no more would we rely on secret agreements and treaties and alliances. Everybody would come to the headquarters of the UN and meet. And if there were any issues that were threatening world peace, because that's the whole point of it, is that everybody gets together to resolve their differences and disputes to avoid war happening again and dragging everybody into another global conflict. And that really what you would have is, as far as America is concerned, there would be 4 policemen, 4 big states that would police things around the world: the United States, Britain, China, and the Soviet Union. Okay. And as I said, they want to make sure that there is no more war. The terror of war would be eliminated in future. Okay. Again, why was this important? Well, it would reduce tension and increase the chances of peace in the future. Okay. It was also agreed, I don't know if the Polish certainly weren't asked about this, that the Soviet Union would start to establish their sphere of influence because they were worried about being invaded, remember? So part of Poland would be given to them, or perhaps given back to them. Possibly that could increase tension in the future, lead to conflict, but that was all glossed over at the time, okay? Here's the plan for the invasion of the Normandy beaches, and the red lines show the Allies soldiers, their lines, they would travel and then land on the beaches, and you can see the planes that were going to be dropping paratroopers behind enemy lines to knock out the German guns, the German artillery before the troops landed. Okay, so yeah, that's the plan for D-Day. Again, you can have a question like this one: the consequences of the decisions, and I've just mentioned a few of those things already. You've got, obviously going to write it in a bigger paragraph. You've got D-Day. D-Day was a consequence. It was about this, that, and the other. 4 or 5 points. This is important because it was the start of the end of World War II. Okay? You can write about the United Nations. United Nations is going to be set up. 4 or 5 bits of information, evidence about that. This was important because reduce tension and would hopefully eliminate war in the future. Okay, and I've written 2 examples there, or you guys have written, and I've just taken them and put them in a neater form. Okay. Also then followed up in February 1945 in what is modern day Ukraine on the Crimean Peninsula, which has been occupied now by Russia since 2014, but then it was part of the Soviet Union, and that's where they all met at in Yalta on the Black Sea. Okay. At that stage, Germany wasn't defeated, but they were certainly on the run. They'd been pushed out of the Soviet Union, more or less pushed out of France, and were in retreat. And anybody with any military knowledge could have told you that there was no chance of Germany fighting back unless they developed what Hitler was trying to develop was super weapons. Okay, and he did try. Crucially, this is the first time that Roosevelt attended any of these, because by the time they met in Potsdam a year later, he had died, and Churchill did go out to the conference at Potsdam, but that was while the general election was taking place in Britain, and he lost. And I think that's the last time that any election in this country was held in July until, well, this year. Okay. What came out of the conference at Yalta? Well, Stalin threw a spanner in the works by saying that what he wanted was some huge reparations. Haven't heard that word since the Treaty of Versailles, but he wanted Germany to pay. Okay, he wanted to pay in money. He wanted them to pay in, well, more or less slave labor. To rebuild Soviet cities, to work for him, to make up for what they did to the Soviet Union in the Second World War. The other leaders said, no, 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 this is not a good idea. Look at what we did at the Treaty of Versailles. By making Germany pay huge reparations, it just humiliated them, and it denied them the necessary cash to rebuild their country quicker. And so when somebody like Hitler was able to come along, he could point to the Treaty of Versailles and say, vote for me and I'll tear it up and we won't have to pay reparations. And even reasonable people thought, yeah, okay, that sounds fine. Okay. So, but there was disagreement over that, reparations. Okay. The Allies, of course, wanted a strong democratic state to develop and not to be punished for the mistakes of the government. They didn't want to punish the people for the mistakes of their government. Okay. They also agreed that the 4 zones that were going to be created in Germany, France would have one of those as well. So Germany itself was going to be split up into a Soviet zone, an American zone, a British zone, and also a French zone. The purpose of those is that they control them, rebuild them, and make sure the Nazi Party are completely eliminated from them and can't come back. I mentioned this as well about eliminating the Nazis. What we're talking about is a denazification process. Denazification. So all the Nazi leaders, members of the Nazi Party at all levels, were going to be hunted down, especially those that were, infamous, and put on trial at Nuremberg, and they were. and many of them ended up with very long prison sentences or were executed for war crimes. Hermann Goering, you can see in that photograph, he's the one with at the front at the top left with his arm resting. He bit into a cyanide pill and took his own life before his sentence was passed. Okay, the purpose of this is why this is important, though, is to make sure that the Nazis can never come back. You know, they can't return to power in Germany and eventually start war again. Okay, so they've got no chance of being a threat ever again. So that's why denazification process is important. How are they going to do it? Various things here. Sack them from all their jobs, set up courts to decide who was and wasn't a Nazi, put the leaders on trial for war crimes and pass sentence on them. Get civilian life back to normal without the Nazis having any influence. Members of the Nazi party, made to pay for their crimes, even if it was just clearing rubble out in the streets and stacking the bricks up and hard labor. Okay, and I've already mentioned they were going to set up an international criminal court or military war crimes court tribunal. In Nuremberg. Okay, to put these people that were deemed to have committed crimes against the rest of the world, and indeed in the Holocaust, to put them on trial as well. I mentioned this already, they were going to divide Germany and Berlin into 4 zones, but at this stage as well, Stalin again has a bit of a wobbler, because he claims that his part of Germany and his part of Berlin is the one that's the worst one. It's don't know how he came to that. I don't know how he came to that decision, because the whole of Germany, the whole of Berlin was pretty much flattened as well. Okay, but he used this as a way to feel resentful. Okay, and he also made it clear at the conference that what he wanted in the future was not just a friendly Polish government, but what he called a sphere of influence. An area to the west of Russia's borders that were going to be under his control. He didn't want them to become free, independent, democratic states. He wanted to make sure that in future he had control of them. They eventually became part of what's known as the Soviet bloc, or buffer states. Okay, this wasn't something that the other leaders wanted at all. They wanted all the countries that had been freed from Nazi control to become free democratic states and have elections and be just like Britain and America and France, and be free again. Okay, not just replace fascism with communism, which happened. Again, a nice question you could have about this. 2 consequences of the decisions made by the Grand Alliance: dividing Germany and Berlin into 4 zones, and the denazification process. 2 straightforward things you could use to answer that question. And I've even put some examples on there too. And again, if you want to jot any of that down, you can pause and write it down. Same with the denazification process as well. Okay. And now on to the final conference of the Grand Alliance within the war, or just after the end of the war, actually. So in July 1945, the Grand Alliance met in a small town just outside Berlin called Potsdam. And this is also a very important conference because they made some big decisions here too. By now, this was how Germany was going to be divided up. I mentioned earlier how there were going to be 4 zones. You can see the British zone, including Hamburg. There's the Soviet zone, and you can see Potsdam just southwest of Berlin, the American zone, and the French zone. Okay, and also Berlin itself was going to be divided up along the same lines. Here's the big leaders that were there. Clement Attlee, he had flown out in July 1945 just in case Churchill lost the election, which he did. Churchill went home. Truman is now president. Roosevelt died in April that year. So he was the vice president that then became president. And of course, he's the one that had to make the decision about the atomic weapons being used on Japan. And Joseph Stalin still there. Joseph Stalin doesn't pass away until 1953, actually. So this is the Potsdam Conference of July 1945. In Germany itself, Germany are now defeated. They surrendered on the 7th and 9th of May already. These are big changes by the time that happened. As far as the military were concerned, countries that had been invaded by the Nazis, then occupied for the duration of the war, had been freed, in inverted commas, by the Red Army, who then decided to stay and just occupy the countries themselves. So people in Latvia, Hungary, Czechoslovakia found the Nazis go, and the Russians arrive and just take over. Okay. In Poland, you had a communist government, even though it hadn't been voted in or chosen by the Poles themselves. Stalin just installed a communist government and took over, even though the Allies were unhappy with that. Okay, he just said, well, it's something I've got to do to make sure that there's no risk from fascists coming back. But they're gone then. What you did have at this stage as well was demobilization taking place in the British and the American armies. That means demobilizing, taking soldiers back home, getting them at the army and sending them home to their families. Didn't happen in the Red Army. Stalin kept his army at maximum levels and again just claimed it was all about security, and he even increased the size of the army as well. Okay, as I mentioned already, Truman is now president. He was quite different in his approach to Stalin. He distrusted him greatly and could see clearly what Stalin's motives were, to take over most of Europe. And he was quite determined that he needed to stand up to him. Okay. By then as well, actually, a couple of days after the conference finished, if you've seen Oppenheimer, you know all about this, but the USA had detonated or tested the gadget, as they called it, at the Trinity site in New Mexico. The Manhattan Project had been set up in the Second World War. This proved it was a success. And as I've told you probably many times, there's this incident out on the patio or on a veranda where Truman goes up to Stalin and mentions to him very carefully through interpreters, or quietly through interpreters, that they're going to do something big in the next few days. And they're checking to see whether Stalin knew about it. And of course he did. He had plans of the bomb itself on his desk back in Moscow. And so, yeah, he tells them that they're going to do something big. And that, of course, was the test at the Trinity site. Okay. And as I mentioned already, Churchill has to go home. He loses the election. And I mentioned this already too, but there's that was the last time we had an election in July, and we've got one this year, haven't we? Okay. Things they agreed. Well, things they kind of re-agreed and reaffirmed, I suppose, is that Germany and the capital are going to be divided up into four, handled by the four members of the Allies. Okay. Germany is having its military taken away, and eventually it sets up a defense force. They agree that there's going to be free elections and freedom of speech and no more oppression, no more censorship in Germany like there'd been before. They also agreed that Germany was going to pay some kind of reparations to the Allies, not along the lines or the size actually of those after World War One. Mentioned this too, Nazi Party is banned. They put in the Nazi war criminals on trial at Nuremberg. The UN is set up. And again, it's reaffirmed that Poland is going to get or be given, to the Soviet Union to create a buffer state. Okay, how much was going to be paid as reparations? They couldn't agree on. Okay, and also the sticking point here was about free elections. Truman was very clear, along with the other allies, that democracy was the best way, because he knew that democracy would lead to freedom of choice, and a capitalist system. Okay, it's a key element of a capitalist system. Stalin didn't want that. He wanted a communist state put in place in wherever he could, and was quite angry with Truman's insistence on free elections. So again, this is an example of, late in the day, the final conference, an increase in tension perhaps between the two sides. Organ of questions. Here's the typical one you might get about the Potsdam Conference. Explain two consequences of it. One could be that there was a difference of opinion between Truman and Stalin. Free elections, just mentioned that, and you'd peel that one. Also, I mentioned at the start of this little bit as well that there was a difference in the build-up of the military. America's got the bomb now, but is demobilizing soldiers. Stalin is, of course, increasing the size of the Red Army, but doesn't have the bomb. So there's tension between the two here. Stalin is keen to catch up, and eventually does 4 years later. Okay, so again, this increases tension on both sides, or both points. Another key element of the Cold War was the Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe after World War II. If you look at the map on screen now, you can see the USSR in dark red, but then you can see these other countries in pink color there: East Germany, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria. These are what became known as the Soviet bloc, later to join the Warsaw Pact. But from a military point of view, these were buffer states. Any invasion that came from the west, these states were to act as buffers, something that would absorb the advance of the military through those countries, giving time to the Soviet Union to prepare its counterattack, I suppose. Okay, but they were all going to be, of course, under control of the Soviet Union. They may claim to be free, independent countries with their own communist party by choice. Don't believe it. Right? They all took their orders, these communist governments, from Moscow. Okay. The map's very interesting. This is a section of Cambridge, all right, not far from London, north of London. And if you're able to see it very closely, you can see that all the names and that are on there and the descriptions of places, they're all in Russian. Okay, same with this one as well. This is a section of London. You can see a very famous river called the Thames. It's all in Russian as well. What can we learn from this? Well, the Russians had maps of the whole of Britain, the whole of Europe as well. Why would they need those? Invasion. They had invasion plans, and they had knowledge of every town and city across Europe, just in case. Okay, so invading countries was something that they could do, and they had further plans to go further into Europe if necessary. Okay, and as I said, until even the end of the Cold War in 1990-91, the Soviet Union was mapping towns and cities across Britain, ready to. They need to mobilize their forces, in particular tank regiments. They knew where they could go. And we didn't know about this publicly until 1993, but they knew everything. The composite of different beaches, whether it was very wet sand or whether it was rock beaches or shale, to determine where would be the best place to land troops, size of airports, the length of runways, height of bridges, names of rivers, street names, that kind of thing. Okay, so the threat of invasion was very real. Okay, of course, on all the map that they had, they knew they had details about military bases. Now, if you look at any OS map, certain things aren't on there. You just have a grey area where it kind of says, well, nothing. All right, that's normally a military site. They had all the details of where the buildings were and how they were connected, and it was the job of a particular diplomat in each Soviet embassy around the world, in every city, who was a cartographer, to make sure that they had these details. Okay. Like I said already, if they had the cause to invade or the orders to invade, they knew exactly where the weak spots were, where the main sites to gain control of a town or city were. Okay, they'd done it before. They invaded Germany and won the Battle of Berlin in May 1945 at great cost. They were prepared to invade cities and to hammer it until a government and a country surrendered. I mean, look at the cost. 81,000 soldiers died in the couple of weeks it took to seize Berlin, and nearly 300,000 were killed. So they were quite prepared, if necessary, to do this. Why? Well, they'd suffered invasions over the years. This is a graphic showing you the course of Napoleon's invasion of Russia in 1812. He arrived in Moscow to find that the whole city had been destroyed by the Russians themselves. They burnt it down themselves to stop him capturing a live functioning city. And he just looked at the smoking ruins, stayed a little while, and started to retreat while the Russians chased him out and slaughtered a few 100,000 of his soldiers. Okay. The Eastern Front. been invaded by the Germans in the First World War. Stalingrad as well was practically just a pile of bricks and ruined building after one of the worst battles of World War II, where you ended up with hundreds of thousands of soldiers being taken to Germany and hardly any of them coming back over 10 years later. Okay, so the point is that Germany had suffered invasions and were determined not to let it happen again. Okay, these are the numbers. I've got 25 million as their casualties. Could be as many as 27 or more. Every death is a tragedy, but if you look at the British and Commonwealth casualties, the numbers of deaths, they're below 500,000. And if the figures are to be believed, then certainly the Soviet Union had paid a massive price for winning what they call the Great Patriotic War. Yeah, I think we've established that if we were Stalin at the end of World War II, we don't want to be invaded again. So how to prevent that happening in future? Tighten your grip on the rest of Europe. Make sure that you just don't rely on treaties and goodwill and hope for the best. Install your own governments, make sure they're on side, make sure they make decisions that benefit you and not them or anybody else. Okay. Buffer zones are created. Also, it gives Stalin the opportunity to spread communism through the rest of Europe. Okay, now Stalin was a great pragmatist. I mean, the days of him being a committed communist went with his youth when he became leader of the Soviet Union. But of course, it does allow, if you've got a government in your neighboring countries to the west of the Soviet Union, that communism is going to be the way people are brought up to live. Nobody's going to even question communism from a young age if they are brought up in that system. Okay. And there were other reasons why he thought that he had the right to take over these places. Okay. As far as he was concerned, well, he hadn't forgotten really that Churchill wasn't always an ally of the Soviet Union. When the Bolsheviks had taken over Russia in 1917, he declared that they were enemies of the human race, must be put down at any cost. Charming. Okay. So, he knew about that. Okay. Also, when Stalin and Churchill had met at the end of the war, they'd come up with something called a percentages deal, where they were discussing through interpreters about who would control which bit of Europe. And Stalin had written, Churchill had written numbers like 30%, 70%, 50-50 about who would control which country. And Stalin had just put a tick on the piece of paper, indicating that he understood and that he accepted it. So as far as he was concerned, they'd had an unofficial agreement that Stalin could do that. Okay. Strategically, it's important for Stalin to control Poland. If anybody invades from Germany again, it's normally Poland they're going to go through because they get to St. Petersburg first of all. Okay. Mentioned already that they had been invaded many times before, and of course, buffer zones, friendly countries, always makes it less likely that the Soviet Union is going to be invaded again. The policy of both sides you can trace back not just to those losses of troops and the desire to avoid casualties in the future, but also diplomats. There was diplomatic reasons, insider knowledge you could call it, on both sides that underpinned, influenced the policy of the USA and the USSR. One of them was the long telegram, one of them was the Novikov telegram. Okay, long telegram. First, George Kennan, he was a diplomat at the American Embassy in Moscow in February 1946. He looked around and put this very long report together. Okay, it's a report rather than just a quick telegram, but it was transferred by telegram, and it's called the long one. It was about 8,000 words, which is about twice the size of somebody's EPQ actually. And what he did was put together his summary, his view of what it was like from within the Soviet Union and what the Soviet Union was planning. And he said his advice to Truman was that the USA needed to take firm action, stand up against the Soviet Union, stop them expanding into the rest of Europe. And Truman took that on board. He took this very seriously, and it became one of the building blocks really of American foreign policy. In return, Novikov Nikolai Novikov, he was the Soviet ambassador, so the person that represented the Soviet Union in America, in Washington. He wrote his own telegram to Stalin in September 1946, pretty much saying the same thing. We've got to watch out for the USA. They're very strong. They've got a big military. They too want to influence the rest of the world and dominate the world economically, which, if you look at it, they kind of do. And this also hardened Stalin's attitude towards the USA. He knew exactly where he was standing, and kind of proved what he suspected all along. Okay, so you got the long telegram and the Novikov telegram, both of which become part and parcel building blocks of foreign policy on both sides. Okay. Here's a quick summary of the telegrams. Okay. How to take over these countries. You remember looking at a map if we had the books and did this. What the Soviet Union wanted to do was set up what's become known as satellite states. In space you've got satellites going round and round and round, but they're controlled from somewhere. That's what Stalin wanted with these countries to the west of the Soviet Union. So in Poland, there was an election there, looked on the surface to be all fine and dandy. It was rigged. There were ballot boxes stuffed with votes for the Communist Party, so they cheated. Okay. In Romania, they just disarmed the Roman army for security reasons, they claimed, but then told the king that he had to appoint a communist government, which he was quite a weak leader, and he did. Same in Hungary as well. They found a way of getting control of what we call the Home Office over here, the Ministry of Interior, and then controlling the police, and then installed their own government. Okay, bit by bit. The elections in Bulgaria, stuffed the ballot box with their own votes. Murdered the foreign secretary in Czechoslovakia. Anybody who was an anti-communist politician, arrested them or chased them out of the country, and eventually banned any other political party from standing up against them. Okay, the only place that they had no success was in what became Yugoslavia, which experienced its own civil war in the 90s and fell apart, and these countries called Serbia, Montenegro, and Croatia suddenly appeared. Okay, but for a time after the Second World War, it was just known as Yugoslavia, controlled by Marshal Tito. And he'd refused to take any orders from Stalin and stood up to him. So he was neither east or west. There was this odd one in the middle. Okay. And the question is normally about consequences of the Soviet Eastern expansion. You can write about the long telegram, why that's important, or the Novikov telegram, or creating buffer states. As always, a Peel structure to each one. And in each case, Long, Novikov, and the buffer states, they're all going to increase tension between both sides. An example of what an answer for those would look like. Okay. And another key event in the Cold War is the development of something called the Truman Doctrine, and then that becoming the Marshall Plan of 1947. Okay. Truman made a speech in 1947 where he made clear what his policy was going to be: support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. Now, he didn't mention Russia specifically, or the Soviet Union specifically, but everybody knew what he was talking about. He was saying that America was going to help countries in Europe stand up against communist party in their country or the Soviet Union outside on their borders. Okay, and that was going to be his rule of thumb for the future, and that became a Truman Doctrine. Doctrine is just a long word about policy, how you're going to do things in the future. Okay. And this meant specifically any kind of military, economic, political help, assistance that you could give to democratic nations around the world, America was going to be there. Okay. And it's that belief that you needed to stand up against the communists that led to the formation of NATO, that's still today, and the Marshall Plan. Okay. Can summarize his policy really also as containment, to keep the Soviet Union within its present borders at the time, not allow it to spread bit by bit. That was called the domino theory, where one country after the other would become controlled by the communists. So he wanted to contain them and stop this domino effect around the world. So you had immediate impact from the Truman Doctrine. Okay, the policy of isolationism was abandoned, and the USA was going to become committed to involvement in European affairs as well. And what he put together was something called the Marshall Plan, which was partly motivated by self-interest, but also influenced by the desire to stop and contain the Soviet Union. Okay, this is what the Marshall Plan was itself. Okay, because Europe had been completely devastated by World War II, cities were in ruins. I don't think there was a roof or a window unsmashed or destroyed in Berlin due to the fighting and the bombing. America decided to put together a fund of 17 billion, which I think 1 billion is the cost of today of Man City's FA Cup team, which played, when I'm recording this, yesterday. Okay, so even by the standards of the 1940s, it's a huge amount of money. America saw this also as an investment because people like Britain and other countries owed them a lot of money, 11.5 billion already, for the cost of war materials that they'd bought off America during the war to carry on fighting the war against Germany. So in one way, it was a way of kickstarting economies so that they could open up factories, get people working, earn money, pay their taxes, and then the governments could then repay what they owed to America, but also to rebuild these countries so that they became capitalist rather than communist. Okay. So on the surface, yes, it was about doing a good thing for Europe, to rebuild cities, rebuild the railways, the docks, the roads, bridges, that kind of stuff. Even ports needed rebuilding so that the economies could start functioning again. Okay, that way it would make the people have a better standard of living, less inclined to become desperate and turn to extreme politics like fascism had become appealing to people after the Great Depression, and he wanted to avoid communism becoming appealing to people after the Second World War. Okay, if he could do that, then it would weaken the Soviet control over Eastern Europe. People would go, nah, we don't want to be communist, so no chance of setting up buffer states and satellite states. Okay, it would also help America because if you've got towns and cities rebuilt in Europe, well, they're going to need steel. They're going to need engineers. Where would they buy this? America. Okay, so it was a wise investment. Okay, and it's named after the U.S. Secretary of State who'd been out to Europe and seen for himself the devastation that the war had caused. So he put together some of the key elements of this plan named after him. As you can imagine, anything America did to stop the spread of communism was going to go down like a lead balloon. He referred to it as dollar imperialism, the Americans trying to create an empire just based on money, buying their way. Okay. He made some claims that America was just trying to control trade and industry. Well, they were to some extent, control it or benefit themselves and also the countries too. Rightly, he saw it as a way of undermining communism. He was right there. He saw it as a way of the Americans trying to promote capitalism, right there as well. And he made sure that any countries that were under control of the Soviet Union didn't take a penny, didn't take a red cent of the Marshall Plan. Okay, blocked them from taking any money from the Americans at all. What he did do instead was set up his own version of two things. One was called the Cominform, Communist Information Bureau, which was communist countries under control of the Soviet Union, spreading ideas, working together to control them. Probably a bit more like the European Union, but in a communist version, okay? And the same thing with Comecon. What you had here was probably this is more like the European Union, I suppose, with the Council for Mutual Economic Aid, shortened to Comecon. That was set up in January 1949, and communist countries were only allowed to trade with each other. So East Germany would make, say, bricks, and they'd be given to Hungary, and in return, Hungary would send them bicycles, things like that, okay? But of course, above all else, it favoured the Soviet Union more. There are stories years later of, in Hungary, people working very long hours making iron and steel, and it goes to the Soviet Union and they don't get anything back, okay? There's a kind of question you can get about the consequences of the Truman Doctrine. One of them is the Marshall Plan. So again, Peel structure, explaining the impact, the importance of the Marshall Plan. Of course, this is going to increase tension between the two, make the countries less inclined to become communist, okay? And also, it upsets Stalin, dollar imperialism, and that again would increase tension between both sides. Also worth this stage having a look at the second question of the exam paper called the narrative account. The narrative is a word used by lots of people in the media today, and what they're referring to is a story. This doesn't fit with the story. This is just their story, and they use the word narrative instead, okay? The question you'll get, and you will get 2 suggestion points here, will be along these lines: write a narrative account, analysing the key ways in which the Cold War developed, which is very open-ended, what's important, what happened, and it'll give you 2 things to use. In this case, it's the Potsdam Conference and the Marshall Plan, and you have to explain those 2, why they're important, but also include, as it says here, your own information. Well, it doesn't say on there, but you've got to include a 3rd point as well. So at the start, in the middle, or at the end, because every story has a start, middle, and end. So that's what they want you to do, to recognize that these 2 are connected. But is there one main event in the Cold War that comes after it, or before, or in the middle of the Potsdam Conference and the Marshall Plan? What can that be? Look, they've got to be in the right chronological order. That's the key point here as well. You've got to know your dates here, okay? For example, you've got the Potsdam Conference of July 1945. Then you've got a period of Soviet expansion. Okay, that's the one that's the new one here. And then, of course, the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, that comes up in 1947. So I would write a Peel paragraph about each of these, about why they're important. Potsdam Conference, in some ways, decrease in tension, but increase in tension between East and West over elections. Soviet expansion, definitely increase in tension. And the Marshall Plan as well, definitely increase in tension between both sides. Now, information here of the kind of thing you include as evidence, okay, in the blue box. Here's an example of what the answer would look like in different colors to show you point, evidence, explanation, and then linking it back. Not on that one, or on that one, okay. Now the next key event, or events really, are related to Berlin between 1948 and 1949. It may get referred to as the Berlin Crisis, but it's referring to the Berlin blockade and also the Berlin airlift. So 2 separate things. That is what is known as the Berlin Crisis of 1948 to 49. Okay. In 1948, on the 24th of June, actually, 1948, Stalin decided that what he wanted to do was to drive the Allies out. So he took the decision on that day to close the border around West Berlin. Nobody was allowed to go from east into west, or from East Germany into West Berlin. Everything was closed. So every road was closed, every tramway, railway, footpath, bridleway, everything was shut, okay, overnight, okay, and it stayed that way for another year. We'll look at why that ended a year later. And the Americans had a choice here. Do they just force their way through and say, well, you can't do this, we've got an agreement, we can go into East Berlin and you can come into West Berlin, or not? If they did, if they sent in troops and sent in tanks and that kind of stuff, well, it could escalate into all-out war. And I don't think Truman was really prepared at that stage to go to war over half a city, but he certainly didn't want to retreat, and he decided, we stay in Berlin. We need to do something else. Okay. The reasons behind this as well, not just Stalin wanted to drive them out, but he had some motives. Trying to stop Britain, the USA, consolidating, it's called, really their hold on what became known as West Germany. Okay, and he wanted to make it clear to all other states that were under Soviet control that they were in control. They dictated what was happening in Europe and Berlin. Okay? The thing that sparked it off at the time, the short-term cause of it, was the creation of something called Bisonia. Bisonia's two zones. Okay, the Americans and the British decided to combine their two zones because they've been working separately up until then, and combine their expertise, their resources, to help industry get back running, rather than get up and running again, rather than carry on being independent of each other. Okay, so Bisonia two zones is what they created. Stalin took this very badly and thought, hang on, what's going on here? They're trying to create their own countries over there. Marshall Plan had been voted through earlier that year too, so it looked like there was going to be lots and lots of money arriving in West Berlin too. And also within Bisonia, this new currency was introduced too, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it's quite a permanent thing. To introduce new currency into a country suggests that the financial systems and the way that you're going to do banking and people are going to save is going to become long term. It's not something that any nation state would do temporarily unless there was a crisis. Okay, so what he saw was the Allies increasing their influence and their hold on what became known as West Berlin, and he decided it was time was the time was right to try and drive them out, but without war. What he didn't want to do was provoke a war, because what the Americans got, they've got the atomic bomb, and he hasn't. Okay. What did the Americans decide to do? Truman, as I said, decided that we stay in Berlin, so it was quickly organized to fly in supplies from the British and the American zone through the air, of course, over the Soviet zone, which became known as East Germany eventually, into West Berlin, land at the airports there, unload the supplies, and then fly back and do that over and over again. Okay, and it started with just a few planes at first, and experts were brought in from around the British Empire to do this, because they'd done this out in the Far East, resupplying rebels against the Japanese. So this whole process was begun very quickly and very small to begin with. Okay, because there are a few million people living in West Berlin, or a few 100,000 people living in West Berlin, who once the roads and railways are shut, and canals are shut too, aren't going to be getting any food into that part of the city, and they're going to end up starving and going cold. Okay. The Berlin airlift was put into place, and I've got some numbers here. Was it like over 2.3 million tons of food? Or there were 2 million people living in West Berlin, 277,000 flights, 300 aircraft. When an aircraft landed, eventually when it was running at its peak, it would be on the ground for about 20 to 30 minutes while it was getting unloaded, and then it would fly off and just keep doing that. Okay. We estimate in the year that it was up and running, 78 people lost their lives in plane crashes, in bad weather or accidents. Okay, and it was going so well that at some point the average West Berliner was eating better than somebody in the UK. In the UK, we had rationing until the early 1950s. The West Berliners were, according to studies, receiving about 2,300 calories a day, which even today is about right. Okay. The German government couldn't compete with that, and they certainly didn't want to shoot down any planes, because that would be an act of war, and that could backfire very badly for them. Okay, so what they did do was tell everybody in Germany that these weren't planes bringing food at all. They lied to them. It's a classic example of propaganda. They said that they were Rosen bombers or raisin bombers. They were, dropping beetles, these little black beetles from the plains, the shape and size of little creepy crawly beetles, into the fields in East Germany to eat the crops and ruin their harvest. Well, of course, everyone in Germany had seen American planes and British planes bombing places like Dresden. That's a bombed out picture of Dresden there. So, the idea of American planes and British planes flying over and causing harm wasn't that far-fetched, okay? So yeah, they were told that these little beetles were being dropped from the plains to destroy their crops and to starve them out. Of course, none of that was really happening. But it just goes to show you how far-fetched communist propaganda can be, okay? Thousands of children across East Germany were given rewards for going out into the fields, collecting beetles in a jar, and then bringing them to school or to the local Communist Party headquarters, and they would get their ration card stamped to allow them to have sugar or sweets, okay? And there was posters and things in school books telling children how to do it. And you've got a thing here from a schoolboy in 2003 describing how they went out into the fields, got as many beetles and little creatures as they could, and they got loads and loads of sweets, okay? You can see pictures here of them having instructions of how to go out into the fields and collect these things. Okay? Eventually, it had to stop because by May of the next year, so 11 months later, Stalin realized it's pointless. It isn't working. This blockade is just being superseded, overcome by the Allies. They've got the money and the pilots, to the food to fly in. He can't stop that. Okay, so the blockade is lifted, okay, and in response, he forms the official government of East Germany, which becomes the German Democratic Republic, the DDR, Deutsche Demokratische Republik, okay? And you can see the football shirt on the right, DDR, that's their football team, probably playing in the 1970s there, for East Germany. The Allies consequently formed the Federal Republic of Germany, West Germany, and you can see Franz Beckenbauer there in that picture as the captain of West Germany. So up until 1990, you've got two countries called Germany, West Germany and East Germany in Europe. What else was the other consequence of this? Massive increase in propaganda on both sides. The Americans, saw it as a great victory. Their money and their might and their planes had embarrassed Stalin. He was humiliated by this. But as far as he was concerned, he just passed it off as a big plan by the Americans to make the Soviet Union look bad and to undermine their rightful control of these countries to stop them being invaded. Okay, so Berlin blockade, increased tension. Berlin airlift, increased tension too. NATO was formed out of this. It became very clear to the Allies that the Soviet Union's next step, after this had failed, this gentle nudge to try and get them out had failed. Maybe the next thing they did would be a bit more serious. Would it be an attack? Okay, so they decided to form the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was a military alliance of member states across Western Europe, led by the Americans. Okay, the rule was that if any one of them were attacked by the Soviet Union, then all of them would come to the other's aid and fight with them. So Stalin now knew that if he attacked, say, Britain or France or West Germany, in this case, more importantly, the Allies would definitely go to war. Okay, so there was no question like, would they not? They definitely would if he attacked West Germany. Again, creation of NATO only serves to increase tension between both sides. This is the kind of question you get. Explain two consequences of the Berlin crisis. Explain why the Berlin blockade was important, increased tension. Okay. And explain why the Berlin airlift was also a consequence, why that was important, increased tension too. You could also mention Instead, if you don't do either of one of those, formation of NATO, again, how that increased tension between both sides. Okay. So the next important event in the Cold War is the 1956 Hungarian uprising late in the year. Okay. Where did this all start? You need to go back to early in 1956, in February, when Khrushchev made the secret speech. Joseph Stalin had died back in 1953, and after a few years of shenanigans, we'll call them, in the Politburo, Khrushchev emerged as the leader, chairman of the General Secretary of the Communist Party, and therefore the leader of the Soviet Union. Now, in this, not annual, but every few years they had this, in this Congress of the Communist Party, a meeting, they'd all been there for days, making speeches and applauding everything that was mentioned by Khrushchev. Just as everyone was about to go home on the Sunday, I think it was, he called everybody to a last-minute meeting. No members of the press were allowed, nobody's allowed to record it, and it was, he just wanted to say a few words to everyone. Well, he stood there for 4 hours and made this infamous speech, and in the speech he did some amazing things, or some until then would have been dangerous things. He criticized everything that Stalin had done. He exposed him for his brutality and his paranoia, and the fact that he was personally responsible for purges that had taken place in the 1930s of the army, the Communist Party, and the Gulag system. Okay, he criticized Stalin's leadership in the Great Patriotic War, and the idea that Stalin had been popular because of cult of personality. Okay, and he promised that this was the end of it, and they were going to return the Soviet Union to the communism of Lenin, the highly revered leader of the revolution. Okay, it was called the secret speech because no one was allowed to know about it, but of course, you know, people around the world, security services knew about it pretty quickly. Okay, this speech is significant because it encouraged some member states in the Soviet bloc, those buffer states, to think, hang on, if we're going to have some freedom here, if he's not going to carry out any purges, maybe it's time for us to break free and go it alone. They tried in May, just a couple of months later in Czechoslovakia. Criticism was made of the Soviet rule by the Writers' Congress. Okay, students came out to protest in May that year in Czechoslovakia, wanting democracy, freedom of the press, less oppression, or no oppression, of course. The leader was a man called Novotny, and he squashed that straight away. Okay, this happened in Poland in June that year as well. Again, people are unhappy with communist rule, lack of freedom, oppression, all those kind of things. Price of bread went up due to a really bad harvest. There were riots. Officials in the government were killed as well. And to make sure that Poland stayed part of the Soviet bloc, Khrushchev actually sent Red Army troops into Poland and snuffed that out as well. Okay. And you can see Gomulka, he was the leader during that time. He was allowed to stay in power and keep control of things. Okay, so that's two countries that have tried to break free already after this secret speech, failed. We turn to Hungary. Now, Hungary had been part of the buffer states since September 1944, when, of course, the Nazis were chased out and the communists moved in. And if you look at the map closely, you can see it's right there at the center of the Eastern Bloc. You know, if they switch sides and go over to the west, over to NATO, then you've more or less got a corridor going from west to east, straight into the Soviet Union. Okay, so strategically very important for the Soviet Union. And who was in charge of Hungary? It was this man, Matthias Rákosi. Now, Matthias Rákosi had, well, in the Second World War, he'd been in Russia, in Moscow, hardline Stalinist. He was, you know, Stalin's man, put in place to keep Hungary under control. People in Hungary weren't happy with, of course, communism. You know, everything they made went straight to the Soviet Union. They didn't see anything or much back in return. They worked incredibly long hours, very dangerous conditions in factories. Religion wasn't allowed at all in the country. Any kind of dissent, criticism of the regime was snuffed out by the secret police, AVH or AVO as they were known. That's the Hungarian equivalent of the Stasi in East Germany or the KGB in the Soviet Union. And of course, occasionally you'd end up with people being imprisoned, killed, just for speaking out and saying that they didn't want to live under a common society, okay? Things came to a head late in 1956. In October 1956, thousands of people came out onto the streets to protest, wanting an end to communism or to change in their system, okay? The Communist Party officials of Hungary wobbled and got rid of Rákosi and installed something called Imre Nagy, okay? He promised to reform and restore order, but of course keep the communist system. He persuaded the Khrushchev to take the Red Army troops that were stationed in Hungary out, okay? But then what he did was a series of measures that alarmed Khrushchev considerably. First of all, he abolished one-party rule, in essence saying you don't just have to have a communist party, you can have other parties. It's also known as pluralism, which we have. So it sounds like a very kind of democratic system, which sounds great to us, but not to Khrushchev, okay? He also made an announcement that Hungary was withdrawing from this thing called the Warsaw Pact, and we'll come to that later. This was the Soviet Union-controlled version, I suppose, of NATO. You've got NATO on the one side, then you've got the Warsaw Pact on the other side, okay? He announced that they were withdrawing from that. I think that was probably the final straw. This would be very, very dangerous for the Soviet Union in terms of being invaded, possibly invaded from the West. So it was game over then, I think, for Nagy. Because they responded very quickly. November the 4th, the Red Army tanks rolled into the capital, Bucharest, fighting in the streets. And Nagy made this announcement, in the dead of 5:20 in the morning, that they're fighting, the government in place. Within hours he was captured, and years later, he was actually executed by the Soviets too. Okay, and he was replaced, and of course Hungary stayed within control of the Soviet Union. The viciousness, really, the brutality of the invasion of the country stunned people around the world, even Communist Party members in Britain and France and all over the world, okay? Because this completely flew in the face of all the stuff that Khrushchev had promised, this return to the old days and no more Stalin-like oppression or violence against people. And yet here he was, responsible for at least 2,000 people dying and over 200,000 people fleeing Hungary as refugees, ended up in other countries. And the fighting continued around the city and the country for months afterwards, okay? What also was significant here is that the Americans did nothing, okay? Even though Eisenhower, who was the president now, had made speeches and noises suggesting that America would help any country that tried to do what Hungary was doing. They did nothing, okay? They made statements saying that they were sympathetic and that what the Russians were doing was very bad, but didn't actually do anything, okay? And if you think about it, what could they do? If they sent in troops, they would escalate and escalate, and both sides now not only had atomic weapons, also had the hydrogen bomb. So you can see why perhaps Western governments were unwilling to send the troops in and put boots on the ground, as we call it. For our part in Britain, we saw the after effects too. 20,000 Hungarian refugees arrived in Britain by Christmas. You even had British people competing to try and get them to come around for Christmas dinner and to settle, okay? This particular question came up on the exam in recent years because it does lend itself very well to the narrative account, telling the story of events that are kind of connected. In this question, it was a narrative account about the Hungarian uprising, you were given the suggestion point of Imre Nagy, Soviet tanks. Well, what caused all that? Well, we're missing the beginning of the story, secret speech. So you'd write a appeal paragraph about that, Imre Nagy, a bit about him, and then the Soviet tanks that suppressed everything. Okay. I've put some examples here of people's answers that I've kind of polished up and broken down into appeal structure for you. Imre Nagy's paragraph here. And the Soviet tanks also important too. Okay, that's more like um, the invasion and squashing the Hungarian uprising. The next chunk I'm going to look at with you is about the arms race and how that certainly increased tension between East and West, making nuclear war much more likely. Okay. In 1955, the Warsaw Pact was set up. This was an alliance of Eastern Bloc countries that were under control of the Communist Party, taking their orders from Moscow. Places like Albania, Poland, Romania, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Bulgaria. They all joined this military alliance that was, the Soviet version of NATO. All of them agreed that if any of them were attacked by NATO states, highly unlikely, but they would all support each other. So you had two massive military alliances either side of the Iron Curtain now, okay? That itself increased the tension between both sides, okay? What we're looking at here then is the arms race, the race to get bigger, better, badder, bigger bombs on either side, okay? So it's an increase, officially it's an increase in the quantity or quality of military weapons and technology between rival countries in a time of peace. There's no war going on, of course, this is the Cold War, but they are building up, stockpiling military hardware to be used in the event of war, okay? Now America, if this was a boxing match, won the first round here because they began the Manhattan Project in 1939 under the leadership of Robert J. Oppenheimer, and by 1945 successfully tested the world's first atomic bomb at the Trinity site in New Mexico, which was then used successfully against Japan on the 6th of August and again on the 9th of August, thereby winning them the war in the Pacific, okay? So yeah, they certainly had the upper hand. They certainly won the first round in the race to achieve military superiority over the Soviet Union. Okay. Stalin, I've put here that he was shocked. I mean, he knew that this was going to happen anyway because of the fact that the Manhattan Project was riddled with spies reporting back to the KGB and therefore putting information on his desk, okay? But when the Americans did detonate or did bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, he upped the pace. He really wanted to catch up with the Americans. First thing he did was treble the pay of the scientists working on the Soviet Union atomic research program, which of course encouraged them to work even harder. I mean, you'd be working pretty hard if Stalin was your boss anyway, because you don't want to end up in a gulag. But the fact that they were getting paid 3 times more now certainly would have encouraged them to treble their efforts as well, okay? By 1949, using their expertise, they also successfully tested their own atomic weapon. And you can see it on the bottom right with the man responsible for the project, Andrei Sakharov, okay? He pops up later again or towards the end of the story of the Soviet Union, okay? So what you have by 1949 is both sides possess atomic weapons, okay? And it continues. It continues from then on into the 1950s and 60s with both sides developing bigger and badder bombs, trying to outflank the other side, okay? You can see just how much money has been spent on these things. America was able to spend 96.4 billion compared to the Soviet Union's 58.5 billion. Both sides by 1953 had developed even worse bombs called the hydrogen bomb, which depended on nuclear, is it fission or fusion? nuclear fusion. Okay, these could devastate entire cities with one bomb. Churchill famously described the whole situation now across the world as a balance of terror. You know, both sides are equally measured up with these weapons, and they're terrifying. Okay, so how big were they? Well, you can see in this graphic, it really does bring home just how devastating these bombs. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were absolutely destroyed by the atomic weapons, and they're just these little bombs down in the left-hand side of corner of that graphic. And as the time goes on, you can see you've got the Castle Bravo bomb and then the huge Tsar bomber developed by the Soviet Union, which is 50 megatons compared to the teeny-weeny 15 megatons of the bomb that hit Hiroshima. Okay. What really gave the Soviet Union an extra edge in the arms race as well was the development of satellites. Okay, satellite technology that we use all the time today. Well, the first one came from the Soviet Union, designed by this genius, absolute genius, called Korolev. There's a book called The Space Race in the library, all about Korolev's life, and it's worth a read. Okay, the launch of Sputnik into space, which is this beach ball sized metal orb with radio transmitters that just kind of went beep, beep, beep for the 3 months that it was going around the Earth. It terrified the Americans. The fact that they'd done this from out of nowhere, they had no idea this was going to happen, and for the Russians to be able to put this chunk of metal that went round and round the world over their country over and over again every day drove them mad, because they knew what this meant, that the technology that had put this ball of metal in space could at some point, with enough money and enough expertise, which the Soviet Union had, could be transferred from just going beep beep into a nuclear weapon that could fall into America and devastate a city. Okay. What did America do? Just like Stalin, when he saw the Americans develop an atomic bomb, they threw money at this problem as well. Missile technology research spending increased by 20%. They set up NASA, led by von Braun, who was the scientist behind the V2 rockets for the Nazis, training for engineers and scientists, and they also increased the number of missile bases they had in Europe, in West Germany, and in particular in Turkey, which later on greatly annoyed the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. This particular question again does lend itself to the narrative account question, and this one was on the paper a few years ago. Narrative account, key events of the arms race up until 1955. And they suggested NATO, the Warsaw Pact, and of course you've got to find a third event that kind of fits in the beginning, middle, or end of this story. Okay, and I've put in here, you probably could write about the Soviet Union's atomic bomb in 1949. Okay, so that in 1949, NATO was set up, and then the Warsaw Pact, which really does solidify the Soviet Union response in terms of military against the West. And I put some examples here of how to break that down into real paragraphs. All of these, of course, straightforwardly are going to increase tension. Yeah, that's the one about NATO. Again, definitely increasing tension between both sides. And the Warsaw Pact also increasing tension between both sides too. So you end the 1950s or into the mid 1950s with both sides kind of locked and loaded.